Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Polly Ainley, Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement at the National Centre for Writing here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. In this episode of The Writing Life, we're bringing you a conversation between the writer Polly Atkin and one of NCW's programme managers, Annie Rutherford, about writing with a chronic illness. You'll hear Polly and Annie discuss writing and navigating the publishing industry as a person who is chronically ill. They discuss Polly's 2023 memoir, Some of Us Just Fall, and explore how Polly imagined time as a chronically ill person. Also, how to advocate for yourself as a disabled writer, and their hopes for embedded accessibility in the future of the publishing industry. Polly Atkin is a multi-award-winning writer, essayist, and poet. She is the author of the poetry collections Basic Nest Architecture, which won a Northern Writers Award, and Much with Body, which was longlisted for the Laurel Prize. She also wrote Recovering Dorothy, the first biography to focus on Dorothy Wordsworth's later life and illness. Without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Annie in conversation with Polly Atkin.
Polly, it's lovely to have you. Welcome to The Writing Life. I wanted to start. I feel like asking how are you is a really loaded question when people are chronically ill. So I wanted to start by saying, how are you on this day, in this moment?
I'm okay. In a little while, I am going for my 10 weekly B12 shot, which is amazing because it always feels a little bit like one of those super serums in superhero movies, that it does give me a kind of instant boost. So that will cheer me up enormously. Other than that, I'm upright. That's okay.
Cool. So we're talking today about Some of Us Just Fall, your memoir, which came out, I think, almost 6 months ago now. Am I right?
It's just over 5, yeah. So it was July the 6th was publication day.
And yeah, it's a memoir about living with EDS and hemochromatosis and the decades-long journey to getting diagnosed. And one of the things that I really loved about the book is that it obviously talks about the experience of living with chronic illness, but it also really reflects it. And I wondered if we could start off by talking a little bit about that.
Oh, yes, please, because that's very much what I wanted to incorporate. I wanted to both explain the experience for people who don't know it, reflect it for people who do, but also create a sense of that experience for readers as well. It was really important to me, actually, in the writing of it.
Nice. So should we talk maybe a little bit about the structure of the book and the way that it kind of reflects a sense of time?
Yeah, let's do.
Okay, so there are chapters. They have headings. I know, crazy format. So you've got sort of various headings that are very, they're obviously very physical, of kind of fracture and dislocation, but they're also quite tied to quite an alienating sense of time or experience. Do you maybe want to take that as a starting off point?
Yes, that's really interesting, actually, that I hadn't thought of the chapter titles in terms of time in that way, but they actually are completely, aren't they? So I know that they're ideas that have metaphorical weight as well as physical weight. So particularly things like dislocation and fracture, they're things that we use metaphorically all the time in ways that I think can be quite troubling and sometimes a little bit problematic in disability terms, in the same way as we use pain metaphorically all the time. And there's a strong discourse in disability circles about not being a metaphor and disability not being used as a metaphor. But at the same time, the metaphorical weight of those words, I think, has something in it which is really useful for thinking about some of that experience of chronic illness. So when I was putting those headings in, I was thinking about aspects of my conditions which are really important and really central to my experience of life as a chronically ill person, and how then they reflect aspects of my life and my kind of biography with my illness biography, as it were. So the things that kind of popped out, dislocation and fracture and diagnosis, were all central moments. In a way, they're kind of spots of time in a Wordsworthian sense, that they're things that both repeat, but are also kind of linked to particular moments as well. But I hadn't thought about the way that we actually use those words to talk about time. I thought about how we use them to talk about place, I think, often. But we do use them to talk about time too. And that's really interesting. And I think must have been there subliminally and not in the forefront of my mind. So thank you for noticing that.
Always bringing new aspects to already written works. And one of the things that's really, I think, quite an identifying characteristic of the book is the way that time sort of builds upon itself, and then sort of, I'm hand gesturing, which is really unhelpful in a podcast, isn't it? But it's almost like a wave. You have these kind of moments of coming forward in your life and going back again, which I think plays into, for me, this sense of kind of fractured, dislocated time, which clearly was not intentional. But,
it was, but I hadn't thought about it. It was very intentional, but I hadn't thought about it in the chapter headings. Bizarrely, I thought about it in every other aspect of how I was putting it together, but not in those actual words.
So you were even more well-rounded than you thought. Can you talk about some of those other aspects? Like, what were they?
Yeah, so thinking about chronology particularly, so a lot of the book is about how I experience time or don't experience time in lots of different ways. And I've always struggled with the concept of linear time, I suppose. And I find there's a game I talk about in it that my best friend Laura and I played together when we were little, where we tried to guess the accurate clock time as much as possible, and we could kind of hone into it in a way, like we were kind of picking something out of a flow of a river. But unless I do that, I feel completely dislocated from clock time, from what other people think is a kind of flow of time that I believe people understand as happening, which for me is not. When I was in my early 20s and I read about holographic universe theory and kind of quantum ideas that all times and all things exist at once, that made a lot more sense to me than anything I'd ever been told about time and the idea of time's arrow. And I think particularly how that relates to time as experienced through chronic illness and through the disabled body, and the concept of crypt time, which I talk about in the book as well, is then highlighted by the kinds of experiences that I write about in this book, but are common to so many chronically ill and disabled people, of going round and round and round these diagnostic processes, but also illness experiences, that you're always spiraling back around to the same place. And I was very taken when I was younger, again, when I was in my early 20s, when I first read The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien, that there's this quote that I quote in the book about hell being circular. And I thought that's how time is for me, especially time when I'm really ill, does feel like this loop that just goes back and back and back. But what I ended up thinking is that it is more like a spiral. And I've read a couple of other people talking about this recently as well, which has been really interesting, because I've not seen anyone else describe time in quite that way before. And this year it's cropped up in a couple of places, of time as looping back around to the same point, but you have different information and different knowledge. So you're never quite in the same moment, but you're always kind of on top of it and looking back into it somehow. And I wanted to create that sense with the book and the structure of the book. And I had quite a lot of resistance from various parties along the way to the idea that you could have something that could ostensibly be a memoir, which wasn't chronological, which didn't start with, I was born in this place and then did that. And then I grew up. And for starters, I couldn't write like that at all because I don't think like that. So it was really hard trying to do that. But also I wanted to create that sense of looping. And in that first chapter, Fracture, I talk about time and how I understood it through my first two fractures, which happened when I was 18 months old and 4 years old. Of time as a bit like the bandages which go around a traditional plaster of Paris plaster cast, and what happens then when you split them open. And that to me is then kind of stuck as an image as well, of thinking about how time opens and closes and loops and can come apart as well, in all of these bodily experiences that we have.
And I think the other thing that then is much more maybe structural, that was all structural, so that's a bad word for it. But something that I really appreciated as a reader who's really struggled with reading because of fatigue over the last couple of years was these really short segments. And so it was a very readable book for someone who can kind of pick it up and put it down. And was that quite intentional, or?
Yeah, very intentional. And I think I started writing like that because it's how I could actually manage writing prose. That I do write in fragments and piece them together later. And it's partly, again, to do with this lack of sense of linear time, that when I'm working on something, I'm actually writing everything simultaneously, like a kind of big writing spider or writing octopus with all of my limbs spread out everywhere, doing everything at once, like all things are at once. And so then I end up with all of these fragments that I know want to come together, but they kind of come together in a kind of mosaic or a kind of a mixtape kind of feeling that I know how they need to piece together. So I was writing in fragment partly because it's what I could manage as a writer who is chronically ill. But I was also thinking about that reading experience of being chronically ill as well, and what you can do in a short period of time or a short burst of energy. And there's a lot of really interesting writing now about disability writing and fragments, and particularly pain experiences and fragments, and how it can do that it can both capture that experience and also be accessible for people who are in that experience as well.
And do you think that that's important to you as someone who's also a poet?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, in a very practical way, again, as well, that I started writing poetry more than any other kind of writing when I was a teenager and I first became really seriously ill, that I realized poetry was something that I could still manage when I couldn't manage the kind of 10-page adventure stories that I'd also been writing up until that point. I just didn't have the stamina for them anymore. So there is something about stamina, but there is something I think also about maybe just how my mind works with metaphor, how my mind works with the space of the page as well, that thinks about things in that kind of slightly fragmented lyric way too.
Nice. That's really interesting. So you mentioned that you had some pushback against the formatting of the book or the structuring of the book. And I thought that could maybe lead into talking a little bit about navigating the publishing scene and the literary industry as someone who's disabled and chronically ill. I know, obviously, anyone who follows you on Twitter will know you have a lot to say about this.
Yeah. I mean, this could be a kind of 10-hour rant if I were to let it out in that way. For this book in particular, it's been really interesting because I had the first full draft of this in 2018, and I started querying agents in 2018 with that first full draft. And it wasn't until Caro Clark, my agent at Portobello Literary, got in touch with me in 2021 and said, hey, are you still looking for representation for that book? That I found someone who understood what the book was trying to do. Or maybe I should say Caro found me and understood what the book was trying to do and saved it, because I had run out of people to go to with it. And I think part of that is there is a lot of tension, I think, between publishing wanting to be more open to diverse voices and people from marginalized backgrounds who it doesn't necessarily understand as a structural thing, but then not having the people within it to understand those stories. and that's the fundamental problem, or to understand the needs of the people telling those stories. So this isn't just a thing for disabled writers, it's a thing for writers of all kinds of marginalized backgrounds and life experiences, that often when we are brought into publishing, it's quite hard to get there in the first place. And then when you do get there, you find that the very basic needs you have are not met by that process. And I have certainly had experiences of that, which is the polite way of putting it. But also for this book, there was really a problem of people just simply not understanding what I was trying to do with it, which I feel a bit better about saying now. Now that some people have read it and gone, this, I do get this, and this is what I needed to read.
I find that so fascinating, given that I've only heard very positive responses of people who felt very seen. I mean, which is what I hoped would happen and has happened and has felt very vindicating to me, because I was certain that that was the case, that there was a market out there of people who needed this book. And in the writing of it, when I was struggling with it, and occasionally I'd talk about it online and people would say, but we really need this book. And then it did put quite a lot of pressure on me when I was getting to publishing it, thinking, is this going to be the book that people hoped it would be and that they need? Or are they going to be really disappointed? Because that would have been really awful on so many different levels. But I just could not persuade a lot of other people along the way, whether that's agents, editors, even editors who really liked my writing, still didn't see that there was a commercial place or value for this book as it was. And that, to me, is a reflection of the industry not really understanding what it's wanting to do when it tries to diversify. I think I would just do a really quick shout out there to Caro Clark, who is absolutely incredible. Yay! And as far as I'm aware, is agenting many disabled writers in the UK.
Caro's accidentally scooping up all of the disabled writers, because they're one of the few people, I think, in UK publishing who actually understands disabled narratives rather than just wanting to represent disabled people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think they're doing incredible work. What advice would you give to someone who maybe is an emerging writer, or maybe is a writer but has recently developed chronic illness and is kind of negotiating things anew? What are the tips that you wish you'd known?
Fundamentally, ask for what you need and keep asking for it. You will have to keep asking for it. You will feel a lot of the time like you're banging your head against a brick wall asking for it. One of the things that I did, which I was encouraged to do by seeing other disabled writers do this, was make an access rider. So it's basically just a Word document which has my access needs in it for different kinds of things, whether that's events or publishing schedules, things like that. which can be quite hard to do when you're chronically ill, and especially in the early stages of chronic illness, I think, when you might not be sure what you do need. And I found that myself often, that I don't know what would be helpful to me. And often things are suggested for us which seem like they should be helpful and actually aren't really, in that occupational health way where you're given all sorts of different desks and chairs and stuff to try. And weirdly, it still doesn't stop you being chronically ill. So it doesn't really help your productivity at all. When sometimes what you actually need is more time, or sometimes less time, or time in particular ways, or clarity of deadlines, for example, for me is a big thing. Like, there's no point in me making myself ill to reach a deadline, and then it turns out that it was pretty arbitrary and no one's going to do anything for 3 months. What's the point in that? And that is a common thing in the book world. So things like that, I think, kind of working out, and unfortunately a lot of that I think is by trial and error, but having an access rider where you can at least put down what you know that you need, it then saves you just time and energy, that instead of having to write it out again for every single person, you can just pop that in a email, and then they don't read it and they still ask you all of the same questions. Is what I found time and time again. So I'd love to say that that process works. I think at least it does mean you can kind of keep pointing back to it and go, you could just read that document I've sent you.
I would say, as an events organizer, I find it really helpful when I know, like, all of these things are in one place. It's all there. And I also think it helps. Like, I remember one year at the festival I worked at, somebody asked for a quiet space. And it meant the next year we were thinking about that.
Yeah.
And I do think, I mean, something that we said to the emerging translators who are doing mentorships with NCW is, like, it's so hard to ask for these things, but remember, you're asking for the people who come after you.
Exactly. And I think that makes it much easier. I mean, personally, I find that asking for things for other people is 10,000 times easier than asking for things for myself. I find it very hard, and have struggled a lot in the past with asking for what I need for myself. And I find it much easier to do it when I'm thinking, this is not just about me, this is about other people too.
What would you like to see non-disabled, non-chronically ill writers and colleagues doing?
Stepping up a bit would be really nice. Not to be rude. I've had some very frustrating experiences this year in particular, as I carry on as a chronically ill writer who can't afford to get more ill. So I'm still actively avoiding getting COVID. And most of the book industry in the UK seems to be really cool about getting infected over and over again. And I know you know that that's not a fun scenario either. And the thing I found most disappointing about that is that I have a lot of messages of support from people. I have a lot of people telling me that they really understand what I'm doing and they support what I'm doing when I ask for access and when I ask for particularly remote access for events. But then what practically happens is that non-disabled writers have gone back to in the large part, to a pre-2020 working life where they are all doing things in person. Those of us who can't participate in that are just blocked out and ignored and largely forgotten about. Our books aren't seen, our books aren't read, we just kind of disappear. And obviously that was happening to a lot of chronically ill people before COVID as well. But the fact that during that year of lockdowns in 2020, we realized that there were ways where we could open these things up and include more people who are housebound, people who can't travel for various reasons. And then that has shut back down again, which some people predicted, and at the time were told they were being very negative and how could they be so mean and rude to suggest that people would shut them out deliberately.
Mhm.
And the most disappointing thing to me has been to see how few people will stand up and even ask questions, even say to the events that they're going to, is the remote access here for people who can't be here in person? If there isn't, why isn't there? Is this something you could do in the future? Could you build this into your planning in the future? And I just don't see that happening on a large scale. And it just feels like another part of the book world in which those of us who can't be visibly present are just then erased, essentially.
Yeah.
Even by people who, will say to you in one breath, I value your work so much. And then turn around and go, oh, I haven't seen you in 3 years. Why is that?
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what you would like for the book industry? I feel like it's so, like you said, there's the 10-hour rant, which is also very necessary, but I also think we need to imagine the new possibilities.
Yeah.
What would you like to see?
So fundamentally thinking about accessibility in planning levels at all times, and that means a wide range of accessibility. One of the frustrating things I've been dealing with recently is some events that I was invited to, particularly to talk about disabled access, neither of which were accessible to me. And I know, and having to go back to those organizations again and again and say, how can you be doing this thing about accessibility and not be thinking about remote access, especially when you're in a place that a lot of people outside that place can't get to, regardless of disability. And that planning level is just not there. So I'd like to see people really putting their planning into action at early stages, rather than tacking thoughts about accessibility on later on where it's never going to work. Recognizing that disability is a vast thing and access needs will vary remarkably. Even within people with the same condition, access needs can vary vastly. So you need to talk to a range of disabled people with different conditions. And you're never going to make everything 100% accessible for everybody, but at least trying and thinking about that as being a fundament to what you're doing, rather than something that you kind of stick on afterwards as a little bit of an extra, is my big dream.
Yeah. I remember years ago, I was doing, as front of house at a book festival, I was doing some disability awareness training. And there was one of those awful, awful games, group work, hate it. But there were these statements and we were meant to say whether they were true or false. And one of them was, the book festival has more important things to spend its money on than accessibility. And I thought that, I mean, the point was, obviously you're meant to say false, but you're meant to have a discussion about it.
Yeah.
And I thought the group that actually came up with the most interesting answer to that was, it's not an add-on. It was, their point was like, this isn't a single thing you're spending money on. It's something you're planning in at every stage of the way, which I think really reflects what you were saying there. But I thought it was such a good way of thinking about it, of it's never just, okay, well, we've got everything in place and now we think about accessibility, because by that point, if you're in Edinburgh, where I am, you've already got a building that probably has steps up to it. So,
exactly. It's almost always too late at that point if you're thinking about it later on. And also because you're never going to have the funding to do it if you're not building the funding in early on. So a lot of people have talked about the fact that the Arts Council England has a specific pot for accessibility as well, but it's really hard to work out how to access that, I think, if you don't already know how to do it. And it can be quite obscure for people. And I think even organisations that do have ACE funding don't know that they can get specific funding for accessibility. But also, the other thing I'd like to see is funding bodies actually prioritising that too. So funding bodies not funding things that aren't accessible, or coming back to things that aren't accessible and saying, look, we would like to fund this, but you have to put an accessibility fund in, and making that a given again rather than an add-on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we recently got funding to do a project together.
We did. It's very exciting.
I know. Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Or do you?
Oh, do I? I said that, and I was like, I wrote the funding bit, didn't I? So
Yeah.
I should say I'm a German to English translator, as well as working at NCW, and I've been translating a 19th century poet called Annette van Droste-Hulshoff. That's the short version of her name. And I was really interested in the fact that Droste she's the only female poet from the 19th century who's really still read in Germany. And she is looking at her biography, arguably queer, and experienced illness throughout her life. And I was aware of that and aware of your biography of Dorothy Wordsworth, who has very similar kind of biographical details and similarly arguably queer, clearly experienced chronic illness. And we wanted to bring the two together, and now we can, which is very exciting, with its Four Nations International Creative Scotland funding. And we're working with a wonderful German writer, Anna Kolubkowicz, who's, again, a little bit of an expert on Droste. And we're creating a poetry psychogeography walk.
Which I think both of them would have been very excited about.
Excited about it. And yeah, I think it's lovely because Dorothy obviously walked a lot and is very associated with the Lake District. And Annette is very associated with Munsterland, the area where she lived in Germany. I've joked that you should have a drinking game of like every time a Moor is mentioned in one of her poems. But yes, she's very fond of them. And one of the things that I really like about that is that we have thought about, so it's something that people can do wherever they are. And the idea is that you could take this for a hike, or you could be going to the corner shop, or you could be at home. Which, yeah, I think is quite exciting.
I think it's really exciting to bring together these two writers who, as far as I know of, have never really been thought of together either. And they have very similar dates and very similar kinds of interests, I think, rather than necessarily biographies. And the idea that we can kind of, we've been talking about it for a while, of these kind of intersecting points between them again, and being able to bring them together and share something about them with other people, I think is really exciting.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. And I think something that for me is quite interesting is I think we think a lot about queer forebears, and people, like obviously Oscar Wilde and Virginia Woolf, and there's a real visibility at this point of who are the people who came before us in a queer sense. And maybe this is because it isn't something that I had spent so much time thinking about until more recently, but I feel like that's still something that's emerging more.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, it's still just Disability History Month while we're recording this. So Disability History Month is from mid-November to mid-December. And it doesn't have the visibility of other history months, as with a lot of disability centered things, I suppose. And what's really interesting, though, I think, is when you start to look at literary history and artistic history, that by our modern conception of disability, huge numbers of the writers and artists we admire were disabled, but often their disability is kind of written out of their biography or skimmed over in some way, as it was with Dorothy. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write Recovering Dorothy and kind of put her back into disability history, because she's so often spoken about as the opposite, actually, as someone who was kind of hyper fit in some way, with all of this walking she did when she was younger, ignoring all of the bits where she couldn't walk or where she had to stop a walk because she had a bowel disorder, and all of these kinds of things that were just part of her daily life and a part of the lives of lots of people. But those are just skimmed over all the time in the biographies. And I think actually probably there's a lot of writers who are like that. And I only found out recently, for example, through Carl Knights, who was an amazing queer disabled poet, that Rosemary Sutcliffe was disabled. And just this year, there's a new republication of her memoir of her early life, Blue Remembered Hills, which is being republished with an introduction by the disability studies scholar Tom Shakespeare as well. And to see these people, and Rosemary Sutcliffe is someone who I read all of her books when I was a child. I loved her so much. I had no idea she was a disabled writer. And being able to see yourself represented both in the texts, which she did do, like, so there are disabled characters in most of her children's books, but also to see yourself represented as a writer, I think is really important to think about what might be possible for you.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm really aware of that in Scotland, as there's a whole generation of female writers who wrote because of Liz Lockhead, and they saw a woman writing in the tongue they spoke.
Yeah.
And I think, everyone from Ali Smith to Kirsten Innes will sort of say, like, I saw that someone was doing this, and it's so important. And I also think it's important in terms of, I know this is something we've spoken about, but what we don't read when it's not our experience. And this is something that I've kind of said, like, I didn't really pay attention to the sentences that said Froster was repeatedly ill from childhood until I kind of had this moment where it hit me, which I think is fascinating, what the bits that we don't realize we're missing.
Yeah. And often those are just bits, and I think that's part of the problem, that you do get those sentences. Like, someone I've been really interested, and another amazing, slightly later Lake District woman writer is Louis, and also interesting in terms of possible queerness is Louis Armitt, Mary Armitt, known as Louis, who is remembered in the Armitt Museum in Ambleside and in the campus of the University of Cumbria in Ambleside. But she was an amazing naturalist and writer. And when I was looking her up, because of her amazing records of the birds of Lakeland, so she wrote all of these naturalist observations of wildlife and flora and fauna in the Lake District. But when I was looking her up for that, it said, of course, she was a famous invalid. And I'm like, what? My excitement at that point. But that's all I know at the moment. And I want to know more. She's someone I want to look into more, because I think she was fascinating in many ways. That she had two sisters as well, and they all had strange experiences with marriage and then singleness and living together. And a really fascinating story.
Well, that sounds incredible. Next biography?
Maybe. It's certainly something for the future. I never know. I always have all of these ideas, Annie. My head, as I say, like this kind of octopodal mind, that I have lots of different ideas. Almost like, say it is an octopus. I have all these ideas hidden under shells on the seafloor. And every now and again, I lift one of them up and go, woo! And then put it back down again. Think, maybe that's not the time for that one. And then one of them kind of takes on a life of its own and hits me on the head. And that's when I work on that one.
I think that's actually the best description of you I've ever heard. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I don't know at this point. I'm so excited now thinking about other ill people in the Lake District. I've lost my thread. This is what happens when you have two slightly brain-fogged people talking to each other, isn't it? We are existing in crypt time right now. I am the octopus on the seafloor, and I'm just waving all of my limbs around right now.
Again, a perfect moment for a podcast, really, really playing to the audio medium here. Well, thank you so much, Polly. This was, as ever, delightful. And I was so pleased to be able to have this conversation with you, but also to share it with others. And I look forward to continuing it soon.
It was so exciting. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Polly and Annie for that fascinating conversation. And of course, to you for listening. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're also on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on the website by going to the Support Us page. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a review, because this helps other writers to find us too. Thanks again. Keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.